Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on All About Web Archiving. I am Miriam Nauenberg, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Jillian Lohndorf. Jillian joined the Internet Archive as a Web Archivist in 2016, where she supports ArchiveIt partners in preserving web-based content. Previously, she worked in the archives and special collections at DePaul University and Rotary International, and as Web Services Librarian for the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She holds a Master of Science in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Jillian brings considerable expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have her with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for questions during and after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here is Jillian. There will be a slight delay while we change presenters.
Hi, everyone. I am Jillian. I am one of the web archivists at the Internet Archive. I spend a lot of time on web archiving, as my title implies. But as Miriam mentioned, before I joined the team here at the Internet Archive, I worked both as a processing archivist and as a web services librarian in Chicago. I have been a longtime user of the Internet Archive, but it wasn't until I was an archivist at one of the institutions where I used to work that actually used the Internet Archive subscription web archiving tool, ArchiveIt. And so that was my first real practical exposure to web archiving. So I've kind of been on all sides as an end user using web archives at a place that was doing web archiving, and then these days at the Internet Archive, where we are building web archiving tools. And I spend a lot of my time talking about web archiving, and so that's what we're going to do today. And I have two quick poll questions to get us started. The first is, familiar are you with web archiving? Yes or no? Give everyone a chance to answer. And I'm ready to see the results whenever they are in. Oh, I see them rolling in. About half the folks are, 57%, so it's growing, 43% no. Great. And the second question, how many folks are doing web archiving at their institution? Either you, or even if somebody else is doing it, but in general, if it's happening at your institution. People, I think we're ready to see the results. Cool, kind of similar-ish numbers. Great, thank you. This really helps me understand the audience. And I think it can be helpful for you too, to see that there are others that are in the same boat as you are. So today we are going to talk about web archiving in three different sections. We're going to do some overview of it, and then we're going to talk about what typically goes into a web archive, where we can find them, and then we're going to kind of dig into some issues of arrangement and description. So just for some context about the Internet Archive and what we do, we are a nonprofit digital library that provides free public access to digital content. And when I say digital, I mean all kinds of digital. So we're preserving the web, that's what I work on, but we are also preserving text, video, audio, software, and all of this is completely open. It's completely free and open to all. And open access is actually baked right into our mission, which is universal access to all knowledge. We were established back in 1996 And then back in 2007, the state of California designated us as a public library. And we're actually in this old Christian Science church in San Francisco. And the Internet Archive has been involved in web archiving from the beginning of web archiving. We are the largest public web archive in existence, and we have lots of projects at the archive, but perhaps more than anything we're known for is the Wayback Machine. There are more than 300 billion individual URLs captured across over 100 million different websites, more than 150 languages. And we're adding to that to the tune of about 1 billion additional URLs each week. And to do this, we spend a lot of time talking about web archiving so people know what it is and how it works. We've built many free open source tools that we share around. And we really share all of what we do so that people can join in and build upon the world of web archiving themselves. So just to get us all on the same page, web archiving is the process of collecting and preserving parts of the web to save for future use, to create sustained and reliable access to web-based information. A web archive contains as much as possible of the original web content. So it's more than just a screenshot or a PDF, but it's as much as possible of the underlying source code that goes into making a website complete. It is a priority to recreate the same experience a user would have had if they visited the live site on the day that it was archived. And this is what that process looks like. From a technical point of view, there are 3 main steps to web archiving: capture, storage, and replay. So a human typically kicks off a crawler. These are also known as robots or bots, but they're little pieces of software that go out to the live web, captures all of that original web content. So this means all of the individual URLs that go into making a web page complete. So if there's a logo or an image, text, background color, URLs that create the look and feel of the page. The crawler captures all of that, as well as the order that those URLs replay in, and a little bit of metadata about the page, like its title. And then it takes all of this content and it stores it in a preservation-friendly file format called a WARC, which stands for Web Archive File. The WARC is the current ISO standard for web archives. Then after capturing and storing the works, you actually need a mechanism to replay those files. You can't just open them and they'll automatically play on the screen. But once you do have a replay mechanism, then you're able to see the page as it looked on the day that it was archived. And all of these pieces really work in concert to build web archives. However, the technologies doing this and the perspectives that bring all of these things together in real time can vary. So let's take a quick look at those technologies. So there are a handful of types of web crawlers out there, but the main 3 are Heritrix, httrack, and wget. All 3 of them are open source, so anyone in this webinar could go out and download them and put them to work with a little bit of technical savvy. There are also proprietary tools that exist where organizations have tweaked the open source versions of these crawlers so that they can perform a little bit differently to do more specialized things. Both httrack and wget download the web content. Wget can do more than just the HTTP and HTTPS that most of us are familiar with on the web, but also FTP. So if you work with government documents, you're probably familiar with FTP. httrack will download the content to a local machine. So basically, it downloads the files right onto your computer. At the Internet Archive, we mostly use Heritrix crawlers. These are the workhorses that go in and capture all of the individual URLs that make up the website. We also have a crawling technology called Browsler, which is a browser crawler. So instead of just following the hyperlinks and downloading files like Heritrix does, Browsler is recording the interactions between the servers that host web content and the web browsers that replay web content, as those interactions occur, more closely resembling how a human user would experience the web. And it's our response to the fact the web is becoming a more dynamic place. Once these technologies have captured the content, they actually need to put it somewhere. So, like I said, there's the WARC file format, that preservation-friendly container that holds web content. It was actually based off of the ARC, which is still used, just not as widely, mainly because the WARC was built off of that and is now the ISO standard. And then, like I said, after capturing and storing the WARCs, you need a mechanism to replay the files. You can't just open them and they'll replay on your screen. There is an open source version of WebAC. The name is tied to the WebAC machine, and you can use that for replay. At the archive, we have one instance that works for the WebAC machine, and then our web archiving service, ArchiveIt, has another. And this is because there can sometimes be replay issues. Perhaps the captured files aren't replaying in the right order, which can sometimes happen with really dynamic content where there's lots of options, things like that. So within ArchiveIt, we will sometimes amend our replay mechanism to improve replay. Which then leads us to the non-DIY web archiving options, service providers. So ArchiveIt is just one example of a web archiving service. It's obviously the one that I know best, but there are lots of other options here. Web Recorder is a free version, but there are several others as well. In general, these services take all of the steps and technologies that we just discussed, and it wraps them up to make them easy to use. And the ones that I've listed here are actively maintained, even being further developed. They're also in the US, but there are more out there, either legacy projects or services that are used dominantly outside of the US. Some of these are free, some of these are paid, but all of them capture, store, and provide access to web content through an interface so that you are not downloading and running crawlers or running your own replay mechanism. And the bonus is that many of these services offer additional features, which often includes search and metadata. And because of the amount of data involved, for many people, search and description are necessary. Which will slide us into our second section, where we'll focus a little bit more on considerations like search and metadata intertwine with larger approaches to access. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions? Okay. So let's start to contextualize web archives into the larger world. Where would we find them? What do they look like? Typically, web archives identify themselves by a banner at the top of the page. Sometimes web archives live standalone, sometimes they can be found amongst other material. So the banner is helpful to identify an archived page versus a live page. You don't typically see web archived content in search engine results because that could be confusing if it's mixed in with live web results. Sometimes people do choose to have their archived pages indexed and show up in search engines like Google. It's rare, but it happens. So what goes into a web archive? There really are as many use cases as there are web archives, but we find that they tend to fall into a few different categories. There are those that are trying to capture content that can't be archived any other way. And this is typically dynamic or interactive content that can't be preserved any other way. So it can't be printed out, it can't be PDF'd, things like that. There are also organizations who create subject-based collections. This allows them to document things like current events or conversations, perspectives that are only happening online. And some really great examples of this are recorded town halls, online exhibits, and social media. It's a big one. We've been involved in some collaborations around things like natural disasters, where communities are trying to capture local online news coverage and community conversations. So for many institutions, web archiving is a natural extension of their collecting focus in their physical and their other electronic holdings. And some organizations also have legal mandates to meet, and this can include state and local laws, institutional records retention policies, or some folks use web archiving to meet Freedom of Information Act requests. And this kind of content can include their institutions or their community's online presence or documents that are no longer in print and are only web-based. There are also many people and organizations who simply want to make sure that their web presence is preserved before there's any significant changes or it disappears completely to ensure continued access to web-based information. And it's always interesting to me to see who's out there doing web archiving. Lots of big institutions, but just as many small as well. I work with as many loan arrangers as I do with big institutions. I work with just as many folks without any technical or traditional training as I do with folks with technical or traditional training. So the variety in the web archiving community will play a part in the next part of our conversation about standardization. But before we go there, let's take a look at a couple of examples to kind of understand this variety, get a feel for the kinds of content that are in web archives, and how and where you might be accessing them. So this is an example of the kind of dynamic content that might be of interest to an organization, but really difficult to capture without web archiving. So this is an online exhibit. It's interactive, there's a lot of dynamic content, but you can't see any of this in this flat screenshot here, right? Like you can't play around with it, you can't move through the exhibit. This is not something that can be printed out and foldered. It also can't be stripped down and put in a database or a DAM, a digital asset management system. And the same thing with social media. The content is dynamic, interwoven, frequently changing. And so where can you find web archives? How are they displayed and accessed and shared? Obviously, the Wayback Machine has a ton of content, but there are other organizations that are out there also crawling content and providing access points. For example, the British Library collects on behalf of the UK, and they provide access through their own interface. Some of it you can access online, some of it you have to be on site in order to see. I had talked about web archiving services. Sometimes they can present content, not all the time, but sometimes. So for example, ArchiveIt partners can choose to share content with the public via archiveit.org. This is an example of Northern Ireland where they share their information. Sometimes the Internet Archive is crawling on behalf of folks who don't want their content available through any of our access points, or they can't have it there because of stipulations put upon them, or they just need it to be somewhere else for their own access needs. So they have things like custom portals. And a really great example of one is the National Archives and Records Association, NARA, and their custom portal, which you can find at webharvest.gov. And the Library of Congress does the same, with a little bit of a twist, where they ask us to do some of their web crawling and then they do some of it themselves, but all of it is accessible through the LOC website. Sometimes web archives are project-based, as with the case of End of Term, a collaboration of between several organizations where the entire federal government web presence is archived both before and after a presidential transition. This has been going on since 1998, and the content is presented through its own custom portal where you can search through the various time periods. You can also find content in WorldCat under the format archival material if you're using the advanced search, or as downloadable archival material as one of the search results facets. Some institutions integrate content right into their catalog. So this example is from NYARC, the New York Art Resources Consortium. They've integrated their web archives right into their instance of Primo. Because of this setup, they've been able to create catalog records that encompass both live and archived sites right in the same record. You can visit their catalog too. It's all public facing, so it's really interesting to see how they're handling that. So how are all of these web archives ending up at all of these different access points? And many of these examples are from internal integrations from web archiving services. So for example, ArchiveSpace, the Archives Information Management tool, has an integration with ArchiveIt. And this actually came out of NYU, who was looking for a way to connect their web archives with their related on-ground digital collections. They applied for and received a Mellon grant, they hired a programmer, and they built the tool that they needed. That is a very specific use case that took a couple years, but there are also lots of options that are already out there. These are typically through APIs. An API stands for Application Programming Interface, but it's basically a way to connect two disparate systems or softwares. And I know this can sound maybe intimidating to folks who aren't super techy, but as you think through how you would want to provide access to web archives, or if you're thinking about how to change or expand how you're currently providing access, keep in mind that many web archiving services have APIs as well as documentation on how to use them. We're willing to help you through it. I presented at a conference a couple of years ago with Christy Sorensen from the Austin Theological Seminary, where she's the only full-time staff member. And she talked in that presentation about how she and a couple of student workers, none of whom have programming backgrounds, use documentation to pull their ArchiveIt collections into their library website to live amongst their other archival collections, just to simply meet their institution's access needs. So this is going to open the door to the last section of our talk here, where we're really bringing together how the technology works with the arrangement and description piece of it. But before we move on to that, it's more of a specific conversation. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I don't see any coming in, so I will push on. So web archives are unique when they come to description. Captured content comes with its own little bit of descriptive metadata. That's usually very sparse because website creators just don't typically include much more than the title. Other metadata that's picked up is really for verification reasons, to show that the web archives are what they are. They're from a certain time period, things like that. Web archives really do benefit from their own human-generated description to explain and contextualize. And this approach to description really needs to fit into how the web archives are arranged, which can be dependent on the technology that was used to capture them, as well as still fitting into larger arrangement approaches and workflows. So it's all a little bit intermingled. I just got a question. How is copyright considered in web archiving? And that's a great question. I'm going to talk a little bit next about the standardization and kind of how this fits in, and we can talk through a couple of examples there. It's a really good question. So as we look to understand how web archives fit into the larger concept of description and arrangement, we will inevitably bump into questions of how web archives metadata differs from other kinds of records metadata, how to create solutions that bridge multiple approaches. And to start to answer this question, Christy Peterson on the archival metadata blog, Chaos to Order, really sums up the quintessential issue. She says, I came to understand that the units of arrangement, description, and access typically used in web archives simply don't map well onto traditional archival units of arrangement and description, particularly if one is concerned with preserving information about the creation of the archive itself, i.e. its provenance. So with that in mind, just last year, the OCLC Web Archives Metadata Working Group, called WAM, released some web archiving metadata standards. And these standards were born out of surveys that, quote, showed that a lack of a common approach to creating metadata was the most widely shared challenge across the web archiving community, end quote. And the resulting document is only about 50 pages long, and I definitely encourage a read through if you're at all involved in web archiving. You do a really great job outlining and contextualizing, giving a lot of general information about web archiving. But the big takeaway from the recommendations is that all the standards are based on Dublin Core. So Dublin Core is a structure standard, not a content standard. So WAM argues that it's a better fit for web archives where structure is key. And they say Dublin Core is a data structure standard that contains 15 elements for use in resource description to encourage a standard approach to simplified metadata for use by any community of practice. It does not include guidance on devising the content of elements, end quote. And the WAM recommendations are purposely broad because they are a reflection of the diversity of the web archiving community. So that means libraries, archives, digital repositories, businesses, governments, individuals. The recommendations are meant to be a bridge to other practices, primarily bibliographic and archival, such as RDA and MARC from the library world, DAX, describing archives, content standard, and EAD, which is encoded and archival description from the archives world, digital repositories using mods, the metadata object description schema, and website creators who are using schema.org. So embedded in the understanding of the diversity of the web archiving community is the understanding that many of the other approaches that institutions are already using are much more granular, since it's thought that these approaches and workflows are probably already well established. Web archiving metadata standards should fit into those already established workflows. So here are the definitions that WAM included. WAM's documentation for each field includes a definition, usage notes, examples, and crosswalks, where they specifically map Dublin Core to other approaches, including the ones that I mentioned just a minute ago. They map to MARC, EAD, mods, and sometimes schema.org. And they argue that these fields can be applied at either the collection or at the item level. The purpose is that they are so broad that they can fit into the different approaches that people are bringing. So some folks already have workflows that have collection level description. Other folks have item level description. You can use this set for all of them, or for either option. And of the 15 established Dublin Core fields, they have, I think, 9 of them that they are a direct match. They haven't really tweaked at all in order to make them more specific to web archiving. And so you will see that there is a rights field. Some folks tend to be more risk adverse, and they are reaching out to websites to get permission first. Other folks are not. I have heard a huge range of people say if it's on the web, it's free and open to the public. We should be able to capture it as we want. And then other folks that are saying no, this is something that we need to be more thoughtful about, and we need to reach out and get permission in order to do this, and then make it clear that we have that permission. So there is a wide range there. It really depends on the use case. For a lot of people, they're more interested in capturing their own content, and so they don't have to worry about that in the same way. It's more of the use cases where they're interested in growing their collections and reflecting the communities or the collecting topics that they're already collecting on. It's not a super satisfying answer, I know, but there is just a lot of variety in approach. So in ArchiveIt, there are multiple ways to add metadata: account, collection, seed, and document. And a seed is the starting point URL for the crawler, and a document is the umbrella term for all of the URLs that go into making a website complete. So seed and document levels are essentially item level description. And the content is captured in a crawl, right? The websites are all captured as part of the crawling process. And a crawl can contain multiple seeds. Crawls happen per collection in ArchiveIt, which is different than how practically all other web archiving services arrange content. Many users prefer to describe only at the collection level, and this achieves multiple things, including better fitting into archival arrangement, into an archival arrangement that's already focused on the collection level description for those that are coming from the archives world. But also, more broadly even, collection level description is a time saver. Some web archives are capturing lots of different websites, capturing them on a regular basis, and this is coupled with the fact that web archiving is often a responsibility shared amongst multiple people. Excuse me. It's sometimes even just a sliver of one person's time or responsibilities. the National Digital Stewardship Alliance they do a regular survey every couple of years, and most recently found out that over half of people who are doing web archiving spend less than a quarter of their time on it. So describing at the collection level is far less time intensive than at the item level. However, there are strong arguments for even minimal description at these item levels, because so often these are the basis of search, which can increase access. And I should note that the WAM documentation cites item level metadata records as the most common level of description for live sites. So for some organizations, there can be an impetus to do the same for the archived sites as well. I had mentioned that example from NIARC, the New York Art Resources Consortium, that they're doing that item level description. They're building it all into one record. But with either option, collection or item level, Dublin Core can be applied in either space. And this is what it looks like to add metadata in ArchiveIt. There are multiple options, but the screenshots here just show collection level metadata. There are also options for bulk item level metadata, so that you are able to do that item level metadata, but in a batch, right? You don't have to go in individually, copy and paste, make it a little bit easier. You'll notice that these are the Dublin Core fields, but that at the bottom, there is a custom field right there at the bottom of the page in that right hand screenshot for those who are trying to incorporate another approach. And we find that this is really commonly used for those who are describing in ArchiveIt, that they're able to take this and link over to other things, whether it's related collections or add custom fields that are necessary for their workflows. And while we're looking at these fields here, I just want to take a second to talk about the different ways to interpret them. So title, right? First fields, it's really helpful to have a title to describe your archived site. Should it be transcribed verbatim from the website? What if it's not clear on the website? Should the title include the word website in order to clarify what's happening, what the resource is? For creator, is this the publisher? Is this the website creator? Is this the subject? It's a news article. Is it the author? Is it all of these things? What does it mean? What does it mean for you? Date. This is really specific to web archives. Does this denote when the site was created, or when it was last updated, or last crawled? Some institutions crawl the same sites over the course of years, right? If you're capturing for a records retention mandate, it makes sense you'd be capturing the same sites over and over. So is the date a range? And does this mean it has to be constantly updated? The WAM recommendations really don't narrow all of this down, so they leave it up to the institutions to make these decisions for themselves. If there are already established workflows, this is really helpful, but if they're not, it can mean that some decisions have to be made right up front. I was recently working on a project where multiple people, mostly librarians, but a couple of history professors, they were all from different institutions, and they were contributing metadata to a spreadsheet that I had set up that just had the Dublin Core field names. I didn't clarify on how those might be interpreted. I had separately sent them some WAM recommendations, but I didn't actually map it on the spreadsheet. And it was fascinating to watch how differently all of these individuals approached the various fields, particularly the description field. Sometimes layout is important. In the spreadsheet, I had description next to creator. And so a lot of people interpreted that as describing the creator. So for some of the news articles, they described the publisher, the platform, as opposed to what the actual individual resource was about. So yes, web archiving metadata can be a little ambiguous. However, please do not think all is lost. There are many institutions that have created workflows that incorporate the various approaches and tools that are already at work within their organization into their web archiving work. Some really interesting examples of that are places like University of New York, Albany. They're really connecting their metadata in an interesting way. Another is the Princeton Theological Society. And I've also seen collaborative projects tackle metadata. Noteworthy here is a volunteer-run group that is behind the capture of the California government web presence. This is a really great project. They were a group of content specialists. So they were government document librarians from a handful of institutions in California. They realized that they needed information that was not available. They were interested in using content from the California government that was only available on websites. For example, people who are running for office or campaigns, things like that, the websites would go up and then they would come down, they would be gone. So they got together and they wanted to capture the content. They were not particularly techie, they're not metadata specialists. But after they completed their crawling, they realized that they needed more description. So they would run what they were calling metadata sprints, where they would come together and work on shared spreadsheets in order to add item level metadata to improve the access and discovery. So pre-sprint, only about 15% of the archived websites included the creator and the subject fields. But post-sprint, at least 85% included those creator and those subject fields. So that's really interesting. They then connected it to WorldCat, so it would be more publicly available. So just to bring this conversation together, some of the factors that go into metadata decisions include already established metadata practices, other systems and services that dictate workflows, overall access, goals, needs, requirements, and then of course, staff resources for both setup and maintenance. So if other digital collections are already integrated to other systems or services, it might make sense just to integrate your web archives there, whether that's your catalog or your website, things like that. You can link from your finding aid. It might make sense for your organization to continue current cataloging practices and just incorporate web archives metadata records with a link. I see that happening quite frequently. Create individual item level records, and then they just link over to the capture wherever it is living. And it's up to the user to just click on that link. Or it might make sense to start a new practice and then use an API to move the metadata between that and the other access points. This is what's happening at Princeton Theological Society. They're able to use an API that pulls in all of the capture dates, and they never have to worry about that date field. It's automatically updated whenever a new crawl is run. So the web archiving community is all approaching description and access in different ways, some slightly different, some very different. So while this doesn't provide a ton of straightforward answers, it does provide the flexibility to fit into what is already happening at your institution. And all of these different use cases are showing that there's lots of possibilities for future considerations. There are very interesting conversations around controlled vocabularies. These can be really beneficial to metadata practices, but also difficult to maintain. Some folks are, like I said, they're doing web archiving in addition to lots of other responsibilities. So they might be balancing several vocabularies. They are not interested in more. Some people find it necessary, especially if they have a lot of people working on this. They're trying to share the responsibilities. There are also lots of creative processes around automating metadata creation. So scraping a site for the little metadata that it does have is one option. But like I mentioned, a lot of website creators just don't include a ton of information. They don't take the Dublin core fields and fill it out in metadata. It's typically just a title and a little bit of information of how the site relates to other websites around it, where it's linking out to, things like that. So I recently heard of a workflow that was actually pulling data from Zotero, the citation service. They would pull the data out and they would create the basis of a record, and then that could just be amended rather than having to create a fresh record each and every time. So it's It's kind of like a version of copy cataloging. I thought that was incredibly clever. And lastly, as I mentioned, more options such as platform integrations or various customizations, things like that, are coming as web archiving continues to grow in use, as we hear from the institutions that are doing the work and their needs, their internal workflow needs, and we hear from users, researchers, the general public, all of those folks who are weighing in on what they're seeing, what they would like to see. So it's all still changing and flowing, which can be a little frustrating as you can set up your own workflows, but it leaves a lot of flexibility, and it leaves a lot of opportunity to change where it goes in the future. So with that, I come to the end of my remarks. We do have plenty of time for questions here. I included my information, so you can also feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to chat with you about web archiving and how it relates to the larger world. And I just wanted to thank you and thank the committee for having me today.
Okay, everybody, as Jillian mentioned, we're open now for questions, so feel free to type your questions into the questions pane. And Jillian, I have a question for you, actually. Regarding ownership of materials, if you work with an organization to archive their material, I'm assuming they retain ownership of it, right? How does that all work? Do you have agreements because you're actually archiving their stuff?
We do not. The Wayback Machine is working in broad strokes, and is really, the goal is to capture as much of the web as possible. We know that the web is a changing place. The average website lasts about 90 days before it changes dramatically or it comes down altogether. In social media, it's like 10% of content is still available 1 year later. So at the Internet Archive, we do not. Other people handle it very differently, and it's not a matter of ownership, but the permissions, right? Being able to get the rights to be able to capture the content and then share it more widely. There are also some laws that are happening around takedown requests and things like that. So it's a little bit in flux, and people are all doing it a little bit differently.
Okay, great, thank you.
Good question with not a straightforward answer, I should say. There is a question, how does ArchiveIt handle websites with streaming media? Does it back it up? That's a great question. Streaming media is pretty hard. Streaming audio and video, it's where the URLs just keep coming. So typically crawls have bounds. The point is within ArchiveIt, it's to prevent you from crawling the entire web. So you have to kind of set the bounds to capture just the portion of that streaming audio that you would want. Capture typically isn't the problem, it's the replay. Because those URLs are coming fast and furious, it can be a little unclear putting them back in the same order. So replay is pretty mixed on that. It's a good question. For preservation, at the Internet Archive, we keep 3 sets of all data. That's preservation best practice. So if something happens to one set of data, we have others. We keep them in different geographic locations. There are also services out there that do this. LOCKSS out of Stanford, stands for Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe. They handle backups as well, particularly for web archives, but I think for other kinds of digital records as well. And then DuraCloud as well. They will help keep backups. And for a lot of these organizations, you're also able to download your works and keep them yourselves. I know that there are some state and local governments where the law requires them to keep a local copy. So they download it onto a hard drive, and then what they do with that hard drive is up to them. The second part to that question was, how searchable are web archives themselves? That's a great question as well. It varies widely. So the Wayback Machine does not have full text search. You can only search at the more general levels, but ArchiveIt does. So you can search within the archived pages. It's kind of a wide range. We make that full text search available to anyone that we work with. It's via an API. And so it kind of ranges in that sense. I don't know offhand about the British Library, which is the other really massive institution. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. And then the last part of the question was, can ArchiveIt back up closed websites that require logins or websites on the dark web? Really interesting question. We do have a feature where we can do simple logins, so just a username and password. We cannot do that two-step authentication, you know, where you get a code sent to your phone and you put the code in the website, that kind of thing. And so we can capture that as well. The dark web kind of depends on the content itself. It can be a little bit of a mixed bag on how it's all built. A lot of it, you know, there are proprietary things that are preventing crawlers, then no, we can't go in and crawl it. So for example, you can't capture your Netflix queue. Unfortunately, things like that can be a little bit more tricky. The next question, how do you take social justice into consideration to a web archive? I'm a student, we've talked briefly about justice in the archive, but I'm just curious how you take that into consideration. That's an interesting question. So I'm in the unique position of, I spend my time building tools as opposed to building collections. And so when we work with folks, we kind of leave it to them to handle that. Some people try to be a little bit more upfront or out there about it, particularly around events. Something happens. We've worked on collections around natural disasters and shootings, things like that, where people are trying to build collections that are reflective of the entire community. And so that there's a little bit more conversation there. But in terms of the Wayback Machine, because we are capturing it in such broad strokes, we really are just trying to get everything that's out there on the web as opposed to various sections of it, things like that. Hopefully that answered your question. There was an ethics in Web Archiving conference last year. It was in New York. And so there are a lot of, the name of the conference is escaping me, but you can look for that information, and they have a bunch of presentations and resources. Last question is, are there plans to add full text search to the Wayback Machine? And I don't know. Part of the reason with that is that the information is so massive. There's those 1 billion URLs every day. Full text search would then require so many more times that in order to store all of that. So right now, that's not where the focus is for, you know, it's just a really heavy resource load. Questions, under what circumstances will ArchiveIt remove a backup web page if ever a person or organization requests it? And the answer is we will remove it immediately if it is, if we hear from an institution that asks us to take something down. For the Wayback Machine, there are takedown requests. You can fill that out and it will be evaluated. It depends if it is your content or not, things like that. And also, and so we actually have a couple of people who spend their time on that. A little break in the questions here. But I'm happy to continue answering them. If anyone has any lingering thoughts.
Okay, Jillian, I'm going to jump in here. Oh, I think I see one coming up. Did something come in?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Can you talk about the interoperability of web archive files? If I download a work form from ArchiveIt, can I open it in another tool? Great question. I love the technical ones. The answer is yes. So ArchiveIt actually offers the ability to upload works. And so does Web Recorder as well. So you can capture something in Web Recorder and then upload it in ArchiveIt, or vice versa. You could see the content there. they are using different replay mechanisms. One is, ours is Java based and Web Recorders is Python based. And so you will see slightly different results. So that's why it's really helpful to be able to move those move those works between replay mechanisms. There are also what are called derivative files from works. Works are kind of big and bulky and kind of hard to use. And so we offer a couple of file types that are mostly focused on the metadata that was captured during the crawl. So I mentioned the title of the website, and we capture a little bit of information about how that site is reflective of the other sites around it. So you can take those derivative file types and give them to researchers. They're not as big, they're a little bit more straightforward, and then they can do some big data research around using those web archive files.
Okay, any other questions from our audience? Okay, I think that's it for our questions. Thanks to everyone who was here today and for asking questions. And Jillian, thank you for sharing your expertise. This was a really, really interesting session. I know I learned a lot here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for coming and for your great questions as well.
We're glad you could all be with us today. You'll soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording. You now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will be in the email as well. Thanks again to our presenter, Jillian Lohndorf. Thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Joseph Nicholson and Eva Sorrell, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. Our next webinar, Cataloging Non-English Materials, is scheduled for August 28th. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be September 10th on mentoring in technical services. Please check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.
Okay, they're gone. That was very,
Yay!
that went really well. Thank you.
I think it went really well. We had so many questions at the end. People were
Yeah.
really interested, Jillian. That was great.
Oh, good, good. That's great. Yeah, the social justice one is something that we're getting more frequently, so that was really interesting. We'll reflect that back to the rest of my team. But overall, it was great, and working with this group was really easy, and I really appreciate all of it, all of your support and the invitation.
Certainly.
Jillian, thank you for presenting with us and sharing this information. It's been very, very helpful.
Good.
Thanks very much.
All righty. Thanks, everyone. Is there anything else aside from sending over my presentation slides?
No, I don't have anything, and we didn't have anything in the question log, I don't think, so we don't have to worry about that. So Jillian, you're cool as far as questions go. You don't have to do any follow-up questions, answer anything. Great. So I think we're good to go. And Alana, you'll send out the slides and the recording on your usual schedule. So yeah, we're good, everybody. Okay. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. This has been great.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.